Now, remember, what's most essential? That's what's essential, that's not. So if you can't remember this, fine, let it go. Just want to pass the exam. Some church fathers held the Septuagint in 250 BC is inspired. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. So if you remember Alexander the Great in the 300s, he's from north of Macedonia, and in his 30s, he conquers the Mediterranean lands all the way to India and imposes Greek culture on all the people. He dies, and his empire is divided in 4 ways. And then out of those 4 ways, of basically his 4 generals, come 2 very powerful ones, the Ptolemies and the Seleucid. The Ptolemies are in charge of Egypt, the Seleucids are in charge of what we see as Syria, etc. So the Ptolemaic Greek Empire in Egypt, one of their centers was Alexandria, and they were very friendly to the Jewish people in comparison to the Seleucids. The Jewish people go there, but then when they're there in the Ptolemaic Empire, they start forgetting Hebrew. So, around 70 scholars, this is tradition, 70 scholars come together and they translate, and all their translations match, and that was around 250 BC, and that's the Septuagint. So, the Jewish people living in what you could call Palestine, they had their own canon, and that canon is smaller than the Septuagint. This Septuagint, though, is the one that you can prove was the one that was referred to when writing the New Testament, because they refer to the Deuterocanonical books. And the Deuterocanonical books are only in the Septuagint, they're not in the Palestinian canon. They're in the Greek canon. Does that help? The scripture that was translated from Hebrew to Greek for all those Jewish people living in Egypt. So, once again, I gave you a full explanation. You just need to pass the exam. You could just remember this. Is that clear with everyone? Mm-hmm. That's essential. These books, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The rest is also important. Yes, the rest are... Now let's move on to translations again. Jerome. So he lives at the same time of St. Augustine, which is 345 to 420. St. Augustine lived at the same time. Their dates overlap, and they knew each other, and they argued with each other as well. So St. Jerome is appointed by the Pope to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin. Because what they had is they had a translation from Greek into Latin. But they wanted to go, right, remember? Look, some church fathers held the Septuagint translation is inspired. They didn't hold that the Hebrew was inspired. They hold the Septuagint was. And also the Orthodox who sometimes hold that as well. But in the Catholic Church, the Pope asked Jerome, go directly to the Hebrew, bypass the Greek, and then translate from Hebrew directly into Latin. Or, if it was in Aramaic, then translate that Aramaic passage directly into Latin. Is that clear? That's what the Septuagint. That's what the Vulgate is. So, he also translates the New Testament from Greek into Latin. And then out of that, we get the Vulgate, but the Vulgate is not entirely due to him. It's almost all due to him, but not entirely. Translations, just briefly through translations. 1546, the Council of Trent endorses the Vulgate, which is largely due to St. Jerome. The Catholic Church, beginning with the Gospel, and this is important too, because this will then distinguish us from Orthodox. We value the Vulgate, and we respect the Septuagint. So the Catholic Church, beginning with the Gospel and Psalms, the Bible is translated into the vernacular. So vernacular is English, Spanish, etc. So they first start with the Gospel and then the Psalms. It makes sense why, right? We have the Liturgy of the Hours and the Gospel is the good news. Gradually, the first English Douay Rheims in 1582 for the New Testament, 1609 for the Old Testament. Douay Rheims, that was in France, and it was a college that trained Jesuit Englishmen to go back to England during Elizabethan times and celebrate Mass and serve the Catholics there at the risk of their lives. So that's the historical context. You don't need to know that, but it might help you. The Douay Rheims is our first English translation. The Protestants in the 1500s translate the entire Bible into the vernacular. For further details, you can read that packet of information I gave you, which is hundreds of pages, and it'll have that in detail with all the different translations. Only in English. So it doesn't go into Spanish and it doesn't go into Vietnamese. But it will be similar, okay?
This is Lutero.
Hmm?
This is Lutero. Luther.
Luther, it would be German. Luther is German. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So it doesn't go through German, at least as far as the languages. Of course, it'll just talk about vernacular. Okay. Yeah. But German, Vietnamese, Spanish is all proper to what is vernacular. We move forward. The Old Testament. Origins. So once again, remember your GPA is not affected, but you will get a high pass or a summa, magna, cum laude, or just a pass. So just remember that. So your goal is to pass the competency exams. Keep that in mind. If something is just, there's too much information, well then just let it go. Just have the essential, enough to pass. And then try to do a little more if you can. If you can't, that's fine. All right? So now let's go forward, is origins. God is the primary origin of the Old Testament. That should be really obvious, but sometimes we forget the obvious. So just remember that. He's the origin, okay? Human authors as secondary instrumental origin. And that terminology, I showed you that magisterial document that uses that term. Principal and instrumental. And they participate in authorship. So if I had a pen, I want you to know that this is such a Catholic verb, participation, so Catholic. Participation, collaboration with God. Not because we merit anything, but because God wills it. He wants to collaborate and participate with us. Authors of the Old Testament. So all I go through here is the Torah, or Pentateuch. And it's, in my view, it's better to say Pentateuch than Torah. Torah, for me, is more proper, and out of respect to the Jewish people, that's their word. But if you want to use the word Torah for the Pentateuch, that's fine as well. Pentateuch just means 5 volumes, 5 scrolls in Greek. So Moses is the primary human author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that was officially stated in 1906 by the Pontifical Biblical Commission. So, however, after 1906, scholars came together and they came up with a documentary hypothesis. And I said, for example, JEDP, because there are lots of variations on this. So according to them, they reject Mosaic authorship, and they say that the first five books of the Old Testament were pieced together by different traditions. Yahweh's tradition, Elohist tradition, and Deuteronomist tradition, and priestly tradition. I think it's Wellhauser who was a main promoter of this. So it was pieced together from different traditions is what's essential to that. So a documentary hypothesis. So, and I want to be faithful and on this, is what is the current teaching now of the Catholic Church? The best I can do is refer you to 2002, when Cardinal Ratzinger, president of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, left this as an open-ended, he had an open-ended approach. For further details, and because I'm not a scripture scholar, I only can teach you the basics, please see that hundreds of pages of documents I gave you for further clarification from a scripture scholar. In that case, it would be Scott Hahn, or maybe it would be Bergsma or Peachy. Okay? That's the best I can do now. So right now, is that if people want to hold that Moses is the primary, remember it doesn't say only, it says primary. Of course, he's not going to describe his death. That doesn't make any sense. And the church fathers didn't think that way as well, okay? It's primary. So, primary human author. And then Cardinal Ratzinger is just saying that to what extent the documentary hypothesis might have validity is open-ended. But you could also say, you don't have to see this as an either-or either. You could say it as a both and. Maybe there's part documentary and part is Mosaic authorship, right? So, but I don't want to confuse you. I gave you the basics. Mosaic authorship or documentary author. And Mosaic authorship, to be precise, all the church was saying in 1906 is he's the primary, not exclusive. That was never taught. The contents of the Old Testament. So we already covered that. 46 or 45, right? Okay? And then Pentateuch, historical wisdom, prophetic. Oh, and yes, and have that down, even though I was stumbling on it. But definitely for the exam, make sure you can just automatically have it on your lips. Pentateuch, historical wisdom, and prophetic. Be very helpful, because then if you have that categorized, then you can start fitting other things underneath that easily. The Torah. So this is an official number. It's number 10 for the scripture topics. So Torah, just a Hebrew word meaning instruction. It can also refer to law. It can refer to law that's in nature. It can refer to law that God reveals. It can also designate the first 5 books of the Bible. The Christian name, of course, is Pentateuch, meaning in Greek 5 volumes. Penta, 5, took, volumes.